The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training Session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our community workshop series and is entitled Coordinated Entry, a Systems Overview. It's my privilege to introduce today's presenter, Mindy Mitchell. Mindy, go for it.
Unmute myself. Hey, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon, barely afternoon for me here in Baltimore. Also joined by my awesome colleague, Nora Breslin, affectionately known as Nora B over here at home base, where we have 3 Noras now. Nora is going to be making sure that we get all of your contributions here in the chat. So please, everybody, just take some time to introduce yourself, what agency you're with, what part of California you're from, and we will go ahead and get started. Again, this is a 2-part series on coordinated entry. This one is going to be just kind of an overview about coordinated entry. I won't go into this assuming everybody is like a super hardcore coordinated entry expert, been doing it from the beginning. I know everybody has a kind of different level of experience. So if you also want to in the chat, like what's your familiarity with coordinated entry? I am a total newbie, have no idea what is happening here, to like, I have been here from the beginning implementing coordinated entry since back in the day before it was even called coordinated entry, something like that. But we are going to start off with kind of this overview, because I think even those of us who have been talking about and trying to implement coordinated entry for a while, in the midst of our busy days and doing all of the important stuff that we do, can kind of forget about the why of coordinated entry. So we also want to talk about that before we get started on talking about the basics of coordinated entry. And then there is a second component to this workshop, which is next week, really doing a deep dive into thinking about equity considerations in coordinated entry. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly that'll be covered in the next workshop. So just to get us started, what is coordinated entry? So we're all talking about it, but let's make sure that we all know what we're talking about here. So I'm going to read a little bit to you in HUD speak. It's a mechanism to shift homeless systems response methods from project-centric to person-centric and based on community-level standards for referrals and program entry. Coordinated entry also ensures that scarce homelessness resources are triaged based on community-determined needs and priorities rather than project-determined ones. So in regular person talk, this really is thinking about the way that we used to do things was individual homelessness providers, and again, all doing really great work for the people that they were serving, kind of made decisions about who was going to get served in the community. Those program level barriers often had an equity impact, right? So even before coordinated entry, there were disparate incomes incoming into programs and outcomes from programs. Often providers, and you guys know I come from a background of a high barrier shelter doing case management. And the providers themselves would often put up barriers to entry into programs. And those would often end up having this effect of excluding the people in our communities who most needed assistance and had the most barriers to stability and probably weren't going to be able to get into housing and to solve their own homelessness without a lot of assistance from the homelessness system. So again, it's about moving from centering what the providers were doing and providers making decisions about who was getting services to the community and the people experiencing homelessness, right? So that's kind of the why of coordinated entry. Another way to think about it is, the bad old days before coordinated entry were, we were just a lot of folks in the pool doing whatever we wanted to do. Individual providers were doing their own thing. Very often people experiencing homelessness were going from program to program to program to program to program, trying to find assistance and not getting any, especially if they happened to be people who had a lot of barriers to stability. And now we're trying to come together as a community. It is not perfect. And let's acknowledge that too. Like the coordinated entry system itself feels really hard to navigate in a lot of places. That doesn't mean that we get rid of coordinated entry. We get back to the why of coordinated entry and think about how to do it better, which is that we all come together as a community and think about how we can best serve all people experiencing homelessness. So again, this is just one of the many ways to kind of visualize what we're trying to get to in coordinated entry, which is thinking about how people are accessing the homelessness system, right? There are a lot of different ways that that happens, and we'll talk about that. Then how we're assessing what's going on in somebody's homelessness situation. And there are these different levels of doing assessment. Some of those are formal assessments, which we'll also talk about. Then we have to think about how we're prioritizing our resources at a community level, right? So we do have a lot more resources now as a result of the increased funding from the coronavirus pandemic, including ESGCV, which is what is bringing most of you to this webinar today. But we still have not enough resources, right? For every single person who is experiencing housing instability or literal homelessness or chronic homelessness, right? So we still have to think about what is the way that makes the most sense for our community to triage those resources, prioritize those resources. And then there's the referral process, like actually getting somebody into housing. And those are all pieces of coordinated entry. And if you guys do have any questions that come up or just comments or thoughts, go ahead and put them in the chat. Nora B is monitoring. And we will have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to do just conversations about coordinated entry. So again, there are some key components of coordinated entry: the entry into the system, how we're assessing folks. We're prioritizing people based on their needs and their various barriers to stability, how we're matching people to the different resources that we have in the community and making referrals, and then finally getting folks into housing. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these. So system entry, right, is exactly what it sounds like. So somebody is seeking housing and services, right? They're either about to be homeless, they're experiencing housing instability, they are homeless, or they've been homeless for a long time. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. Think about all the different ways somebody with a housing crisis might be touching your quote unquote system. And what we're really talking about here is your larger community, in this case, officially the COC, right? So it might be in the case of unsheltered folks that it's interaction with an outreach worker. So that's system access right there. It might be in some communities when people are calling into 211. A lot of communities now have kind of the coordinated entry system. The access point is 211. People also come into service providers' building locations, right? Especially if you're a shelter, people show up there. So that's also another way that people access the system. And those are things that we have to think about when we think about designing a responsive coordinated entry system. How are all the different ways that folks are coming into the system? Another key component of coordinated entry systems are that assessment process. So this is when people touch the system, when people either reach out for assistance or outreach workers are going to them for assistance. We're assessing the situation. What's going on in your life? The important thing about doing things in a coordinated entry, coordinated system kind of way is that we're doing this consistently across all different kinds of people, individuals or families. There's some kind of uniform decision-making process that's happening here, and some kind of standardization so that its outcomes are not just dependent on the luck that someone has about just happening to land at a particular provider that just happens to let them come into the program, which is how things were before. So some of the relevant assessment factors that communities include in their assessments includes looking at what are somebody's needs, what are their strengths, what are their preferences, right? So it's not just community-centric, it's also person-centric. So we're asking somebody, what are your preferences for solving your housing crisis right now? We also want to better understand what are the different barriers that people face in getting back into housing. We want to know how long they've been homeless, how long this particular time of homelessness has been, how many previous experiences of homelessness, and then what are some things that might make them more vulnerable while they're experiencing homelessness, and that might lead to more difficulties in maintaining housing stability once they get back into housing. So most of this information is, of course, self-reporting. And we have to understand, too, that part of what we're doing, especially at an initial assessment, may not be all of the reasons and all of the factors that need to be considered. So there's an understanding going in, especially at that first contact, that there may be underreporting of some conditions. The next component is prioritization. And this is where usually each community kind of decides, we have this pool of resources, right? And here are all the things that are available in our community. And by the way, it shouldn't just be COC resources or ESG resources, like a really responsive, robust community coordinated entry system has a mechanism for including additional resources that are happening outside of those official homelessness funding streams, right? So you have public housing resources, you have child welfare resources for families that have been involved in child welfare or for young people who have aged out of the foster care system, right? Like all of those kinds of things should be part of that conversation when we're thinking about prioritization, but especially for our scarce homelessness dedicated resources. We want to take into account things like what is the severity of the level of someone's service needs? What other factors are going to influence stability for this person while they're experiencing homelessness or a housing crisis, and then once they get back into housing? So is there a higher risk of illness, death, right? Victimization if someone remains homeless? How often has someone been interacting with the emergency system, right? So you get a lot of crisis services that are involved for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness for long periods of time. Does a person experiencing homelessness have some significant physical or mental health challenges? Are there substance use issues that need to be addressed or considered? Do people have functional impairments? Those are kind of all of the considerations that as a community we need to come together and think about when we think about how we are prioritizing the different resources that we have available. And the next component is, once we've decided what our prioritization scheme is, how do we match folks to the resources that are available in the community? So it's one thing to sit in a room and say like, okay, we have on the table these COC funded resources, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. We have these ESG funded resources, rapid rehousing, some other stuff. We have these, oh, hey, these emergency housing vouchers that are available as a result of coronavirus funding. Oh, we have emergency rental assistance that's available in our community as a result of coronavirus funding. Oh, we have these great vouchers for young people who have aged out of foster care, right? Like really mapping out all of the resources that are available. That's done. Now, how do we do the work from getting, I have someone standing in front of me who's being assessed, who meets X criteria for individual programs. How do I match them to those programs? How do I also, on the other end, let the person experiencing homelessness know, here are the things that are available for you and that you're eligible for. Does this get you where you want to go? Having that problem solving conversation too about the resources that are available. Next up in the components of good coordinated entry are the referral process. So this can be sometimes where things get hung up, and it's something that communities have to be really thoughtful about. So there's communication involved. That's always difficult, especially in a time where a lot of us are still virtual. So someone has done some matching. And now I have to get the communication has to include the people who are doing the matching, the client, right? The person experiencing homelessness, and the housing program that has that resource. How do we streamline that referral process so that people are getting into housing more quickly and getting to the place where they need and want to go? And finally, The end result of coordinated entry is placement. So people are getting into housing. And I think sometimes the things that we get lost in are losing sight of that final goal, which is about ending someone's homelessness, getting them back into housing. So we want to make sure at the same time that we're designing coordinated entry and we're implementing this thing for this really good reason, that we don't get mired down in all the other stuff before we get to that point of placement, right? So some of the things that at the program level, right, that can be a hindrance to people actually getting into housing are making sure that folks have all the documents that they need. So there's been a very thoughtful process in our ideal system to make sure that folks are document ready before they can get into the placement into housing. So the client, the program, other partners in the community are all working together to make sure that those barriers to getting into housing have been addressed quickly, and that placement can then happen with the least slowdown as possible. And I think it's always really important to, when we're thinking about coordinated entry and assessment, that assessment process especially is something where a lot of communities got hung up. And a lot of communities were just really thinking that this was about the assessment and we have to use a certain tool, and this is the tool that we're using, and this tool itself tells us where people need to go. So I just want to say a few things about assessment tools, and I think a lot of communities are making some changes there, and that's good. First of all, no particular tool was ever required by HUD. What was required is that the community comes up with that kind of uniform, standardized way of assessing everybody, so that there's not one program was assessing people in a certain way, another program was assessing people in a certain way, a third program was assessing people in a certain way, and no one knew exactly what the assessment for programs were and how to implement those. And so again, it ended up having a really inequitable outcome for people who weren't able to navigate the various different programs, bouncing around to the different programs, trying to figure out what the assessment was and how to get into those programs. So it's really about coming up with some kind of standard community-based, community agreed upon way to determine what people's needs are and how to get them into different kinds of programs. For a long time, communities used the VI-SPDAT, and some communities still do, but there was misconceptions even about what that tool was supposed to do. It was never meant to be a matching people to housing types. So some of you may be familiar with, and some communities still do this, if you have a certain score on the VI-SPDAT, you go into rapid rehousing. If you have another score, you go into permanent supportive housing. The SPDAT was never meant to be that kind of tool. It's not a housing assignment tool, right? It was a case management tool, and it should be that, and it shouldn't be a housing assignment tool. So we know why communities kind of went in that direction. It felt like an easier way to go, to just really think about like getting people quickly into different types of housing. But remember, this is also, in addition to being community-centered, it's person-centered. And at an individual level, we do not have the capability to predict who is going to need which particular type of housing and who is going to succeed with what kind of intervention. So rather than just having a score, assigning people to housing types, we should do what's called progressive engagement, right? Like, so we're making sure that we get people into the housing that they need to get out of homelessness and achieve stability. And then we see with all the supports that we can provide them, whether or not they can succeed in that housing type. And hey, most people actually do, right? And then we also have a chance to see actually, so this intervention is not working as well for folks. And now we know at the individual level that this person is going to need something more, rather than making an assumption from a score on a tool that they needed a higher intervention. Another thing to say about different assessment tools is that in some communities, particular tools seemed to have a racially disparate outcome in scoring, but other communities actually with the same tool had a completely opposite outcome in scoring. So there were a lot of different factors, and I'll talk about this in a minute, that can affect the score on a tool, including who's administering the tool, and lots of other things that go into a community and how they implement tools. So it's not just a blanket like this tool is inequitable, don't use this tool. It's more about how you're assessing people and what you're assessing for. And I'll talk a little bit about that now, but then next week's session with Donald Whitehead is going to be one where we really kind of delve deep into that, but we're really asking the questions as a community. What do we want to be assessing people for? How do we want to use the assessment that we're doing to equitably prioritize resources for people experiencing homelessness, including those folks that we know historically, without some kind of coordinated community effort, are completely left out of homelessness resources. So finally, this is just another way to kind of visualize the coordinated entry process, right? And this provides an opportunity for us to think about in that entire process where inequities might get introduced into the system. So at that very first stage, right? So we either have people who are calling in, right? Making contact with the system. So 211, something like that. That's where a lot of places are doing it now, or where outreach is touching folks, right? And then making referrals to the system. You ask questions at each of these points to think about things like, if someone is calling in, who feels comfortable? Maybe there are group disparities in who feels comfortable or who has the language accessibility to be able to access the access points that we put in place. Do people know about it? Are there maybe some group disparities in who is actually getting the advertising about how to reach out if you're experiencing a housing crisis? And then in outreach too, right? Like who's doing the outreach? Who do people experiencing homelessness feel comfortable connecting with at outreach? Where is outreach happening? Are you reaching all groups of people experiencing homelessness the same? And really having those kind of thoughtful conversations as a community at the same time that you're actually moving forward and getting folks connected to housing. In that initial process too of assessment, asking these same kind of questions, like as you're thinking about document readiness, we know that for various reasons, some groups are less likely to have access to documents for various reasons, including just losing ID. Being unsheltered itself means you lose things, right? Like you're moving around a lot. It's hard to hang on to stuff. So some folks just may not have the documents that they need. And then we also have issues of undocumented immigrants that literally don't have the documents. And what mechanisms have you put in place that might be barriers for those folks too? When Cynthia and I first made this chart, it was before the pandemic, and we were talking about, do people need to come into offices? I think a lot of us moved away from coming into offices, but think about it, right? Like that's another thing. If people have to come into a physical location to do an assessment, have you created a barrier there for any group of folks who don't have access to transportation, right? So that could be another way that inequities get introduced. The assessment tool itself, like I said, the tool is just a tool. We have seen across communities, some tools appear to have a disparate outcome in one direction, but in different communities, it's a disparate outcome in a different direction. Some communities don't have disparities in the outcomes from their tools, which says that it's more about how the tool is administered than the tool itself. So you have to think about who's doing the administration of the tool. What are you trying to measure with that tool? Who's getting assessed? Are you even having a disparity in who actually gets to the point of being assessed with the tool? When is the tool being administered? How long is the tool? Like somebody shouldn't have to sit through a 40-page assessment process, right? So thinking about all of those kinds of things and how those different things can introduce inequities into your system. Again, each part of the coordinated entry system, you need to do these kinds of questions and to see, have we as a community kind of built some barriers, inequitable barriers into the system at this phase too? So in prioritization, which populations has your community decided to prioritize? Are there some inequities in that population before prioritization even happens? And thinking about the consequence of that. Does a score on a tool create different levels of prioritization, right? So that was another thing that we've already talked about. Like this tool, some tools were not meant to be assigning people to housing tools. They were meant to be case management tools and thinking about someone's barriers to stability tools. So having a score to match for certain kind of housings may not be the way to go and might possibly be introducing inequities into your system. Matching phase, same thing, asking similar kinds of questions. Who's doing that matching? Who's getting denied? This is where the importance of looking at your data is really is part of the equity process. So I'm looking at who's doing matching. I'm looking at during our matching phase, are there any group disparities in who's being denied? Same thing with enrollment or actually referrals and getting people into housing. Are there some disparate outcomes in who gets referred and who gets denied? And is that happening from certain programs more than others? Those are all things to think about when we're thinking about making sure that our coordinated entry systems are equitable. Okay. That is all of me talking. Now, we really wanted to take this time to have you guys share with us some of the challenges that you're experiencing in your community with coordinated entry, ideas that you have about how to hang on to the why of coordinated entry, but make it better, right? So that we make sure that we're still able to serve those folks that historically got left out of homelessness system altogether. And Chris, I won't call on you yet, but you guys know Chris because he's been kind of the MC for all of these resources. But Chris also has a really long history of working at the system level and being really thoughtful about building out those systems and a systemic response to homelessness and how coordinated entry can be that and be better. So really good to have Chris on today as a resource as well. Anyone have any questions? Any thoughts? What's happening with coordinated entry in your community? I see a hand raised. Stows?
You can unmute yourself, just as folks know, or maybe they don't know. Or we can unmute you if you're not sure.
I don't have the ability. I don't have the, oh, there we go. Go ahead. Still can't hear you though. Okay, that might have some technical difficulties there. Anyone else have any thoughts, comments, questions? What are you struggling with coordinated entry in your community? Melissa, I see in the chat. So how do we think about equity in services when people don't want to sign a release of information? Chris, I'm actually going to give you a warning on that to have your thoughts on that.
Okay.
Chris is working one-handed today, you guys. So
I am, and it's not my dominant hand. So Melissa, the question is trying to center serving folks who do not want to sign a release of information and how that might be based in equity. I mean, I think my only guidance around release of information is that most times when I have either have a client say no to releasing information, or I've seen agencies or case managers have trouble with that, is not being able to clearly describe why that release of information is so important. We do have this tension between, you know, and this goes to HMIS as much as coordinated entry. We're talking about reported information. We're talking about every answer could be don't know or refused. And that it is our job to try to help folks navigate to releasing their information. I think folks that we engage that are hesitant to share information have been burnt before. So we have to also separate how we're going to do it different, how we're going to protect folks. I think anytime I see at a system level a lot of folks saying no to release of information, it means that there's either misinformation or there's not clear guidance on why that release of information is so important. To be very, very clear, there's almost no way to operate coordinated entry without good data and share that information with other folks, because we're not just siloed anymore. We broke those silos down, so we have to be able to share information. As far as how that relates to equity, I'm not as clear on how I should answer that part. So if you have more guidance from Melissa, I'm happy to take that so I can try to get clearer on it. I can say that it is probably bearing out in several communities where folks who might identify as a minoritized population would be less likely to agree to release information, again, because of that history of either oppression and or us not treating them well as a system. So I'll leave that there for now and see if Melissa has anything else to add.
And I'll just say, I think that's probably if it's the same thing with thinking about assessment tools, like looking at your data and saying, does the release of information, do we see a pattern here, a group pattern with folks who don't want to do release of information? And if we do, asking why, right? And it may be about who's doing the administering of the whatever the thing is that's happening where you're asking for a release of information, right? And do we have folks who are doing the assessment who look like the folks who are being assessed, and those kinds of questions. Bahia, I see in yours, home ARP programs include those at greatest risk of homelessness. In our consultations, we are told that COCs do not include that population. How do we get COCs to include that population? So I have a couple of things to say about that, Chris and Nora, and then other folks too pipe in. So I think first of all, as with many things, there's a lot of misinformation about what who's eligible for COC funded programs. It is true that for really good reasons, COC funded programs are predominantly targeted to people who are either in unsafe situations, actually, those are the folks at the front of the line, if you think about prioritization, who are literally homeless or who are close to becoming literally homeless. So when we talk about who's at greatest risk of homelessness, the risk thing is really hard to be precise about. In many cases, people who have high rent burdens are at risk of homelessness, but most folks who have high rent burdens never experience homelessness. So part of the conversation about preventing homelessness is but for this intervention, would someone ever have become homeless in the first place? So this gets to the definition of homelessness, which there's a lot of misinformation about, right? So there is a triaging within the HUD definition of homelessness that includes people who are at risk of homelessness. The definition already includes those folks. It's just that the COC funded and to a lesser extent ESG funded resources are triaged based on safety, being unsheltered, or being less than 2 weeks away from those situations, right? And so when you're thinking about home ARP, which there's also a lot of TA about to come out about, some COCs will be prioritizing people who are at the very front of the safety and unsheltered line, and home ARP can then be possibly a resource for those folks, or home ARP can also be dedicated to folks who are further down the line, meaning in a timeline, they're further away from being literally homeless, right? So it's not that COCs don't include those populations. COCs prioritize resources for people who are unsafe and unsheltered or really close temporally to being in those situations. And that's a good thing. And home ARP can then come out and fill out those other resources if the community decides that that's what they need.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to this is the practical application that we're trying with California HCD around this, which is, with ESG-CV and ESG funds, we have deprioritized homelessness prevention. That does not mean we do not think that homelessness prevention is important. It is. We just don't think that ESG and ESG-CV, given their rules, are effective at that. It's just a program design problem. So California City is saying, we don't want to use our funds for housing, for homelessness prevention. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing homelessness prevention elsewhere. So I wanted to make that point. The second point is lost in my head, I think. It was definitely about, housing problem solving. So HCD is also getting prepared to release a new policy on housing problem solving, where, as folks present as homeless for the first time, or at risk or immediate risk of homelessness, helping them find more appropriate housing destinations than an emergency shelter or a program where they need long-term support. A lot of folks come with assets that they're not either willing or able to access, that we need to do that work and help them access it. So with those two things, that's kind of the philosophy from the state of California level. But again, homelessness prevention and stopping the inflow into your system is extremely important. But I think in California, using HAP or cash or other state flexible funds that allow you to do more than ESG and all the regs and rules around ESG and ESG-CV is probably best. What we've seen in the folks that we have monitored around homelessness prevention is a lot of stuff is on the fringes of what ESG and ESG-CV calls eligible, but it doesn't mean the client isn't in need. So we're trying to strike that balance of really allowing you to help folks flexibly while still managing the ESG and ESG program within the many myriad rules and regulations that HUD has placed upon that very small program.
I was looking to try to find, I also did what I hope is an informative flow chart about the definition of homelessness that just kind of does that, but I can't find it. That kind of does that same thinking, like when you think about all of the resources in your community and who's eligible for those resources. Home ARP can be one of the bigger pool kind of things, right? And then the smaller pool that there should be dedicated resources for people who are unsafe and unsheltered, right? And there are really good reasons for having those dedicated resources for those folks. Monique, I see in the chat here, getting consumers document ready. Case managers have so many consumers they work with, and sometimes they stop at the assessment portion to enroll their consumers into CES, but then the documents fall by the wayside. I think as a former case manager, thank you for lifting up the huge job that case managers have, especially when there are so many folks that we're working with. And I think that's part of when you come together as a community and you're thinking about, in addition to asking those equity questions, also asking, like, within each of those portions, who's doing what job and what's a reasonable thing for those folks to do. So if a case manager has the role of helping folks deal with documents, also doing assessments, maybe that's too much for a case manager to be doing. And maybe there's a different way we can think about division of labor in that, especially if we're seeing that that's starting to create backlogs, right? Chris, do you have any ideas about that too?
I do. I think one of the things when we use the term document ready, I think it can be a very loaded term.
Yeah.
We have to also remember that some of the documentation that we require may not be required at all. I think we've seen many circumstances where folks say, I need to get this document. I'm like, why? Well, I've always had to get it. Well, do you really need it? And certainly we've worked with some communities in California where, okay, we're just going to follow what the Public Housing Authority needs for documentation. Well, that's going to be a lot more than maybe our programs actually need to get folks ready. Also, landlords may be asking for things that are inappropriate. So also knowing your tenant rights and making sure that you're not being asked for something that is completely not cool, and knowing where that thing is. I don't know all those lines. I just know I've seen them crossed, before.
Thanks, Chris. Other folks, I know we have a bunch of people on the webinar today, and I know a lot of you have a lot of experience working in coordinated entry, in HMIS, doing case management. Thank you, Monique, for bringing that up. Please do share your perspectives. You all can learn from one another about what's working and what's not working in your communities.
I think we also had a follow-up question from Melissa about HAP being more flexible than ESG, and do the ESG regs apply to that funding?
And as far as I know, and Nora B, I think you work in California as much as I do. I don't believe ESG regulations apply to HAP. I think that would be counterproductive to what HAP was meant to do and what all those funding sources from Cal ICH or BCSH are meant to do. That said, Melissa, I am no expert. So if we want a definitive answer, we're going to have to go to Cal ICH and BCSH to get that question. You may have within your community asked or applied that to your operations, but you probably don't have to. I'll also say the ESG state regulations are, and I'm not sure, I think this is public, so I don't think I'm saying something out of line, are going to go by the wayside. We have been given guideline authority. So we're going to be writing guidelines for the ESG program that will supersede the ESG regulations, hopefully in the next couple of years, to streamline the ESG program as much as is humanly possible. And Tuesday's giving me a heart, so I'm feeling like I can say what I just said publicly. So that's going to give us a little bit more flexibility too, because I think what we recognize about the ESG and ESG-CV programs is it's a small amount of money with a ton of strings. We want to eliminate as many of those strings as we can at the state level. At the same time, our advocacy at the federal level is also saying remove as much of this as we can. Let's make this truly an emergency solutions program, not emergency with conditions program. So I hope that the ESG-CV experience has given us enough to allow us to make some changes to the ESG program, make it less restrictive, make something that would be good for all of us.
And we have another question from Lauren in the chat who says we have a PSH provider in our COC who's inappropriately exiting clients, discriminating based on protected traits. What are some short-term ways case managers can push back with this as a CES is working on larger scale oversight?
Chris, I'm going to let you start that one.
Okay, I'll start that one. I think if folks
I have feelings, but I think there's
yeah. So I was deferring to Mindy because this feels like a very legal question. If folks are being exited based on discrimination based on protected traits, I would be finding my local fair housing authority, whether that's someone within the local government or maybe you have to defer to someone at the HUD field office, but fair housing would clearly not allow this to occur. And we need to get someone in there that can say this is not appropriate and make some changes. Now, if you don't want to go that far, Lauren, at least opening the conversation up and saying, this is what we think, and it sounds like a fair housing violation. Can you give us some rationale of what's happening here?
Yeah.
That may be a more friendly way to start, but ultimately, if folks are being discriminated against, we have mechanisms for that. And I believe there is a way to submit fair housing discrimination cases, and I'm sure that Mindy knows this better than I do, via HUD itself.
You also, any of you have been on any conversations with me, I think a lot of times getting lawyers involved actually doesn't help in the long term. And so I think, Lauren, you talked about the coordinated entry system works on the larger scale oversight. I think ultimately that's where if we do see a pattern with a particular provider, right, there are a lot of system level mechanisms to make changes with that provider, and sometimes it might be worth a deeper dive. I have no idea the community and the provider that you're talking about, but like it may appear that people are being exited for various reasons, but on an individual level, at a case level, there may be some things that went down that we don't know the whole story about, right? So I think there's always benefit in having conversations. And is that the role of the case manager? No. But the role of the case manager is housing stability. So if it's a case manager in a PSH program, that's a whole other like employee employer issues that might be happening there, if there's things that a case manager can do that we know are leading to potential exits from programs, right? Like, are there things that case managers can do to support whatever the alleged reason for exiting is, to not have exits happen? I do think if it's a provider that has a pattern of doing a thing, it's going to have to be happening at a system level to address that. And there are system level changes that can be made. Melissa, how do you make those system level changes? Send that information to the group. So there are policies and procedures, right? Like there are requirements now for most contracts, that there are things that providers have to adhere to, housing first principles that providers have to adhere to. I guarantee you there's fair housing in the policies and procedures of that PSH program, right? Like, it's in every contract everybody signs. So it may just be a matter of saying, hey, I would like to show you the contract that you signed that says you can't do this thing. And having a conversation about the consequences of continuing to do the thing that's in the contract that you said you wouldn't do the thing, right? And those consequences can be up to and including losing your funding. So that's not the job of the case manager to have that conversation, though. Like, that's somebody at the system level that needs to be having that conversation with the provider.
Thank you for that feedback. Yeah, this provider, I'm just trying to kind of gain knowledge wherever possible. It's a long-standing provider who has quite a monopoly in our COC, and so I'm just trying to gain knowledge before we do a large-scale overhaul. So if there were just some advice that I mentioned to the case managers, we're just, making sure that they're in the room with PSH staff when possible, so that we're getting that full story, like you mentioned, making sure that we're getting copies of all documents that clients are seeing, just making sure that we are prepared on both ends with documentation and what's the terminology being used, and if that terminology is equitable. But yes, it's trying to just make sure we have all of our bases covered with regarding to like in-house counsel and all that good stuff. So thank you for your insight.
Yeah.
And I think there's sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the conversation starter is to, at a coordinated entry committee or at the COC, oversight committee, to begin the conversation. We should have limited exits from permanent housing back to homelessness, like as few as is humanly possible, unless that's the client's absolute desire. And working with the clients, meeting them where they're at. I think, when I hear what you said, Lauren, it sounds like we have, the old school mentality of clients need to conform to our programs instead of our programs need to conform to our clients. We're not here to serve ourselves. We're here to serve our clientele. And if we're not doing so, and folks are exiting in a rapid or at a higher rate than we should expect, we need to get to the bottom of that, because that means we are not meeting the needs of our clients, which is what we should be changing our systems to do. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Mindy.
No, that's Lauren. I was just going to. Who are the case managers? Not PSH case managers? Are these some?
We have some case managers who work throughout the CES continuum, or just whether it's outreach case managers or case managers from different shelters in the area who are assisting with the housing referral. And so just wanting to make sure that the clients are prepared for the housing match. But we're seeing that there can be some mystery or some not full disclosures when it comes to referral. So we are in the process of doing a lot of CES overhaul right now. And this is one of the big projects to tackle. So that was just one of my recommendations to all case managers system-wide, is making sure you have all of your documentation. You've read the lease, you know what to expect, so that we can prepare clients for it in a behavioral sense, to make sure we do know what's going on both sides, so that we know if someone is, exited, we know the actual true reason. But yes, I saw a question in the chat that I actually was going to ask. Would it be COC oversight that holds providers accountable at this level for a system change? Is that the correct course of action?
Depends on the funding stream, depends on the community and how you've set things up. So who holds, Christina asked in the chat for everyone else, who holds providers accountable for not providing the services that are in their funding or grants contracts, right? So let me tell you guys, my ideal system is somehow through a miracle. I don't think it's a miracle because communities have figured this out. Everybody is rowing in the same direction, right? So whatever your funding stream, whatever the grant, public, private, all of it, we're kind of all going in the same general direction, so that we don't have to then respond to your question, Christina, with this really unsatisfying, well, it depends on who the grant is from and who did the contract, right? And I think that's part of what HCD is trying to do, is to make sure that everybody's kind of rowing in the same general direction, so that I don't have a different accountability mechanism for my ESG one and my COC one and my PSH one and my rapid rehousing one and my private one and my child welfare one, right? Like all of that kind of stuff. So taking some of that out where we as a community are holding one another accountable. I think, Christina, this question also gets to me another thing that Lauren was talking about, or sorry, Melissa, maybe it was you. Now I'm getting everybody confused, but it happens a lot of times in a community where there will be like one provider who is like the big fish in the small pond and can really kind of hamper the ability of the community to do a community thing. And then I think that's where it's even more important for all of these funding streams and public and private and everybody to kind of be on the same page to balance out that power imbalance of the provider who kind of is controlling what the community is doing. Chris, you were doing some head nodding.
Well, probably. You said some good things. I think this, Christina, this is a really tough question because it also, on top of all of the things that Mindy said, you also have your local governance.
Yeah.
Which gives authority to different entities based on how you're organized. Ultimately, if this is COC funding, the continuum of care itself and the board of the continuum of care most likely in your community would be the entity that would have to take this on. But I've seen in this circumstance where we might take this on a case conferencing, we might look at this at a coordinated entry committee, there might be just a general COC meeting where we talk about these type of things. I think if we are looking for our grant holders, the folks who give us the grant money, to hold folks accountable to this, to coordinated entry, I think that's probably a bad idea. I can at least speak for my experience with California HCD, and understanding the nuances of your coordinated entry system is very hard for a state entity where there's 44 communities that are doing coordinated entry in 44 different ways. So as long as you're meeting the very minimum expectations of HUD around all the things that Mindy said, assessment, access points, all those things, it's going to pass muster with your funders. But that doesn't mean that the outcomes and folks being discriminated against, we're going to not necessarily see that in monitoring or in your client reviews. You're going to have to be able to have these conversations locally for the most part. That said, again, if there's blatant discrimination, HUD has fair housing folks that can help you. But starting these conversations locally and trying to come to a resolution is the best way to do it. Now, I know those come with a lot of emotions, and those can be very difficult to navigate. So it's definitely not easy. If it was an easy answer, we would have given it to you. Instead, Mindy and I both gave you very complicated answers.
Many feelings will be had, and maybe some ugly crying too. And that's when you turn your Zoom camera off. I always too, like, this is hard. This is complicated stuff. And y'all, it's hard being a case manager. It's hard running a coordinated entry system. It's hard doing HMIS, but I always try to tell myself it's even harder to be homeless, right? So we can acknowledge what we're struggling with, but then kind of always try to bring ourselves back to why are we doing this? Like and it's why I always start the coordinated entry conversation with the why did we decide to do coordinated entry? It's really frustrating. In some places it felt like and still feels like a dumpster fire, right? But we don't want to lose the why of doing it in in the hard part of the making it happen, right? So as much as we can come back together as a community, really have that touchstone of why we're doing this, and then figure it out, right? And have these conversations from talk to case managers and say, here's where the barriers are for my getting documentation. So we have the community networking, community mapping, like all of that stuff, but then talking about where it's getting hung up and being willing to say, if I'm a provider, right? Like, oh crap, this is on me. Here's what I need to change about this process. Let me acknowledge where I'm putting a barrier up and stop it, right? Christina, I'm looking in the chat. I know in the AOD field, if a program is accredited, they can be audited. Yes, not meant to be a negative. A program that is accredited must follow a standard practice of care. Could this apply to shelters as well? There are lots of feelings about that. As a lawyer, there's always a reason for something, right? And sometimes it's nefarious reasons, sometimes really good reasons. And then in the practice, it ends up not working out well at all. I thought I saw a hand raised too.
Yeah, it's Christina. Christina, anyone can unmute yourself at any time to join us in the conversation. To speak specifically to what Christina put in the chat, I know some states, like the state of New York, is going through the process of accrediting shelters. It's a lot of work at the state level to do so. And I still don't trust at a state level that you can truly understand the nuance of a community that has hundreds and hundreds of shelters across hundreds of different counties and communities. And I think that applies very well to California, where you have 44 COCs, the most of any state in the country, where trying to do this would be very difficult. I've not heard that California's taken this step. Obviously, if they would, we would, advise you how to handle that. But the idea of accreditation for shelters and the idea of like the right to shelter, that both things play out in the state of New York, play out not always in the most positive way, which is what Mindy was alluding to. So Christine, if you have more, you are unmuted, you go ahead.
Yeah, so for some reason, my thoughts just, they go to some barriers that have been experiencing a lot lately, and it has to do with the family housing. And it seems like when getting participants doc ready, there's still these barriers. In coordinated entry, there was a referral process to prioritize families, those who are most vulnerable, high risk, and several other different factors. So this prioritization process took place for this family housing property. And once these participants were identified and prioritized, we thought that it would be a smooth sailing after, but it turns out that after the referral process, the property not only does their own screening and their own background checks, which is another set of barriers and another set of screening. And then after that, SHRA, the housing authorities, they also do their background checks and their screenings and things like that. And so it's frustrating when we have to identify those who are vulnerable and who are high risk. They're going to have baggage. They're going to have some money owed to landlords. That's why they're in the position that they're in. And so it's just like I said, it's really frustrating to have to explain to participants, you don't meet the eligibility requirements for this property because you have an eviction or because you owe money. Well, that's why they're where they're at. So how do you coordinate with these other providers and say, hey, look, we're already screening, we're already, prioritizing, without, having to hear, well, it's funding, it's because of the grants, it's a requirement from HUD, so it's like, what do you do when there's this barrier still? And so we're back again to where we started. Participants waiting or can't be housed because they don't have the perfect credit score, they don't have a master's degree, or they don't have this income that is, sufficient enough for them. And it just blows my mind.
Oh, Chris, I was waiting for you. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I clicked. I'm not used to using a mouse with my left hand, so I'm clicking all over the place. Sorry about that. Christina, I feel your pain. I think I'm not sure how to tackle this first. I'm just going to start talking. One of the things that we've seen specifically in the PHA space is that we don't have enough vouchers. So let's find folks who are deserving. Let's find folks who are the least hassle. We don't have the time to case manage folks. So folks who've already been through the process. That is obviously an extreme conflict between what we're supposed to do in the COC program, which is find the hardest to serve and serve them.
Right.
And that is definitely a construct that has to come closer together. I think the other piece of this is not all of the rules that we have put in place are HUD rules. We have placed so many barriers upon ourselves because we've either wanted folks to deserve housing or we needed to just weed people out because there's just too many people. It's resource scarcity.
Yeah.
So for instance, in the chat, I would love to see how many of you believe that HUD requires a photo ID to get permanent housing funded by HUD? Yes or no? You see those different answers coming in? The answer is we don't require it. The housing authority might, but it's not a requirement from HUD. It's something that probably landlords need to get folks in. It's not a practical requirement of HUD itself or the COC funding. It's a practical requirement because the landlords you're dealing with want it or need it. We're not telling you have to have it. It is not something that you can find written in a rule or regulation as far as I've ever seen, Mindy.
Heather says City of Reading HUD and Shasta County HUD require it. So when you say Shasta County HUD, which entity is that? Is that the PHA? Or it's the county as a government requires it for various?
It's mostly likely the HCD office. But the folks who fund City of Reading and County of Shasta do not.
Shasta County Housing Authority, right.
So the housing authority to put these rules in place because it's made their life easier. And I'm not saying it's wrong. If that's what your landlords want, you're going to grab it. But HUD itself, HUD, the entity that's granting the money to those folks, is not requiring that. That's just a really basic example. If it's that, imagine all those other things you have to tick off that may not actually be there. And this is where educating ourselves as a community on what barriers are real and what barriers are things we've imposed over years because of scarcity or that kind of thing is really important.
Yeah, Christina, ID, Social Security card, birth certificate, all of that required by the housing authority, right? So this is where, so you guys know I used to work in policy. So big level policy, the COC model is a really different thing for federal funding. Like this requirement that the community come together to apply for funding together, to perform together, that's really great for that funding stream. So you guys are within this context of a COC, and coordinated entry is happening for the COC. There's also so much more funding out there that people can and should get access to, and resources, especially for people who are not literally homeless or not unsafe right now. It's great to talk about coordinated entry. I do think like the why of it is good, but it needs to be a bigger community conversation than just your COC and those COC programs, right? There's in many communities, the COC is the only funding, but in a lot of communities, it's a tiny piece of the puzzle on housing and homelessness, especially in some of the bigger cities. So I think it has to be like, as hard as this is to do, like there have to be those bigger community conversations. And if you guys will permit me, I'm going to try to make what I'm about to show you fit into the conversation that we're having now. But it's related to something that we talked about earlier, which is the definition of homelessness. Can you guys see that picture now of another flow chart? Okay. So you've probably see me do this one again. So this is just, it used to drive me crazy, the misinformation about the definition of homelessness. So all of these people are included in the HUD definition of homelessness, but there is a triaging mechanism, and this is pretty old. So just use this as a visual. Don't go by the exact things that are in the little boxes, because there's different resources that are available now. But for this conversation, what I want us to think about, like, these 4 categories, I'm pointing at my screen over here and you guys can't see my finger on the screen, but those 4 categories are COC funding, right? And then ESG funding. But for the bigger community conversation, and I think the way to address a lot of the frustrations, especially at the case manager level and at the individual level that we're experiencing, is this big yellow, is that a pentagon? Is that a 5-sided? Is that what we call the? Yes. So this thing down here, right? You have other federal, state, local, private, all of these other resources in your community that need to be a part of this bigger community conversation that you're having, so that you have the people who are not safe and the people who are outside, you can get them connected quickly to all those other resources. But oh my God, you have home ARP, you have emergency rental assistance. Where are emergency housing vouchers going? Where are those FUP vouchers going, right? For family unification and for young people aging out of foster care. What about that great United Way program that's purely flexible funding? What about my community action agency and the resources that it has? All of that in a really, really effective system is bringing in all of those other resources and thinking about how it is also connected to coordinated entry. So for example, in Houston, they have the employment system as part of their coordinated entry system, including in some places, it's a co-location in the assessment center. At the same time that you are getting assessed for housing resources, you're also being assessed for employment. My God, there's an employment system out there. You know, you guys have heard us talk about homelessness at its most foundational level is a mismatch between how much housing costs and how much someone has to pay for housing. So you can work on both sides of that equation, right? Like, can we possibly, for some of these folks, increase income so they have more money to pay for housing? So Houston was trying to do that. As we're doing this larger community level system planning, it is part of the COC. Coordinated entry is required for the COC, but can we also think about how to build it beyond that and really make it a larger community effort? So that all of those community resources are in there. And oh, by the way, if you can do things at the assessment level or the intake level or whatever that level is, where I say, what all are you eligible for in our community? Oh, wow, you were in foster care and you aged out after age 16. Holy crap, we have this great housing program for youth who aged out of foster care. I could potentially, in a well-built system, I could potentially get you into that resource. And then we don't even have to think about these other scarce resources that are COC or ESG funded, right? But that requires a lot of thoughtful conversation at the community level, and frankly, beyond just your COC and ESG providers. I don't know if folks found that helpful or not for the larger conversation, but and just for definition purposes.
Yeah, I mean, if folks did find the flowchart helpful, could you put this in your PowerPoint as well as we send it out?
I will, and I probably have to redo that flowchart to make it more accurate, because this is from like 4 years ago now, and there's so many more things that are relevant to the conversation. And also, I just love sharing flowcharts. So all you anti-flowchart people, just, deal with it. Okay.
We did have a couple other questions about talking about the VI SPDAT versus progressive engagement. Yemi said my county uses VI SPDAT and relies heavily on it. Would love to change that. And then Caitlin wanted to hear just more about progressive engagement in general.
Oh my God. So Chris, we should probably have a community workshop on progressive engagement if we don't already. And I was furiously searching through, trying to find another flowchart about progressive engagement, and obviously an oversight on my part to not have made a flowchart about progressive engagement. I'll move this over here so you guys can see it. This is from an older, this is boring, it's all text, but I wanted to have something to refer to about progressive engagement. And trying to think about it in a flowcharty kind of way. So where many of us went wrong with assessment tools, the VI SPDAT, but other communities have used other things, is thinking that I'm going to give you this tool. We're going to have a score. The score is going to tell me what you need. Not, hi, individual person right in front of me. I'm not going to make any assumptions about what you need. I am going to try what is effectively the thing that our community has that's most efficient and quick and gets you into housing. And I'm going to give you the most supports that I possibly can based on what you tell me you need. And we'll see how that goes. At the individual level, I'm going to keep revisiting, hey, how's it going? So in the context of reality, what happened was rapid rehousing versus permanent supportive housing. So for many of you, you had communities that said you get a score of X, bam, you go into rapid rehousing. You get a score of Y, bam, you get into PSH. Well, PSH, everybody, this is not rocket science. It's a really expensive intervention. And so if your community dedicated all of its resources to PSH, that would be really great for the few people who got into PSH, but you would have a whole lot more people who would still be waiting outside, right? So progressive engagement says, rather than assuming at the individual level that anybody with a score or whatever else thing that we have decided a group of people needs to go into a particular housing type, we're going to start with, in this case, rapid rehousing, but you can also start with diversion, right? Problem-solving conversations. We're going to start with those resources and then see, right? We'll see. So in the case of rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, this document is actually from the VA, which is where the most research, right, and actual evidence of using this mechanism has been, because the VA veterans have a lot more resources in general. So we can actually see from this pool of folks, like what's working and not working. So it says, let's not make any assumptions about you based on a score. Let's try this intervention, which is much more cost effective, which is rapid rehousing. And then at the end of that intervention, if we see that you're going to need more and longer, then we have PSH, right? So instead of front loading this really expensive and intensive intervention, which means we don't have enough for everybody in the community, we'll wait on the back end and make sure that you need something that expensive and intensive. So it just ends up working a lot better. It's more efficient and effective for the whole system than starting everybody based on a score, which is an assumption about what they need.
And Heather had another question about, are other communities using coordinated entry to automatically connect people to resources? They just enter people in coordinated entry and people are put on the list according to VI SPDAT. Then the different agencies go off of that list to start pulling names, and Butte County does the same.
I think that's probably still the model that most communities are using. I don't think it's a best practice to say your score means you're going on a list for a certain type of housing. That's not progressive engagement.
I think I'm going to go back to one of my favorite conferences I went to, and actually I think it was here in Denver, and the folks from Canada were here, and they were explaining their coordinated entry system. And this isn't just because I love Canada and love hockey and all the things. If anyone know me, you know, I actually have a Canadian tattoo. I love Canada, but they said, you know, trying to distill folks down into a number is difficult. We know we have to use some tool, and the tool does this, but at the end of it, we have the ability, and they actually had a button in their little system that said, I know better. I know this doesn't accurately describe what's happening with this client. And I think what we've seen happen with that here, at least in my experience in COCs across this country, is that we try to do that at case conferencing. So if you're just putting people into a system, assigning them a number, and that number assigns them a housing outcome, that is not best practice to me. We have to have that other piece. This is humans talking about humans. Numbers have a place, but it is not the inflated place that we have used the VI SPDAT and their scores to put it in. This band gets this band gets this. I remember having a conversation about career entry a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the idea of dynamic prioritization. A number is not static. Humans are not static. If we were doing this session last week, I would have an arm that's working. I don't have one that's working this week. People change, circumstances change. We have to be able to bring that into the decision-making process. That's the part that's missing when you automate number to human to housing. And that to me is the part that we have to, in the next couple of years, really break down across COCs across this country. Is assigning a number to a human has never really worked out well for us. We have to have those other things. Also, doing a full SPDAT, which is like 1,000 questions, is maybe overkill. To do what we need to do as far as getting someone from crisis to stability. Maybe we don't need to know 1,000 things. Maybe we need to know 20 things. And honing in on those 20 things will help us better prioritize than knowing everything about everyone, which really just boils down to how high do they rank on a vulnerability list, which is not getting us to the place we need to be. So I felt that was a little soapboxy. I apologize. I wanted to answer that question directly.
Something you said then too, Chris, made me think about this, the conversation that we've been having today about getting back to the why of coordinated entry. And I think that graphic about questions that you have to consider in each phase of coordinated entry, their equity implications. And I think an important part of, as we're coming together as a community and having thoughtful, purposeful conversations about the thing, whatever the thing is that we're doing, is saying, why do we do it this way, right? So where the SPDAT is concerned, why do we ask 1,000 questions? What is it that we were trying to get to with these 1,000 questions? It's not assigning housing, right? Like what the SPDAT originally was, it was a case management tool to assess vulnerability to death, right? Like someone's vulnerability to really dire physical consequences and outcomes, which is a different thing from saying, I'm trying to figure out if somebody needs rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. Those are very different things. So part of the really good community conversations that can happen as you all are thinking about the current design of your coordinated entry system and what you want it to look like moving forward is saying, okay, here's the thing we've always done. Why are we doing the thing? Is the why an important thing to hold on to? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but a lot of times it is, right? And lawyers, right? Like the reason for many of the laws that exist, there are really good reasons why the laws were shaped the way that they were. They end up in practice not working out well, and that's a different conversation. But let's ask the why. Do we want to hang on to the why of why we're doing a thing? And then say, how do we hang on to the why and do the implementation part better, right? So we think the why is a good reason. What's hanging us up from getting it done though? And what can we change about that? So I think those are parts of those conversations. I think that is, again, case managers, like that's where bringing in that case manager perspective is really important to say, okay, you say on paper, the why of doing this thing is this, this, and this, but in reality, people don't hang on to their IDs when they're unsheltered, right? So being able to have those conversations is really important.
Yeah, I think the other part about the 12 equals this and a 3 equals this is it also doesn't take into account that what the client even wants.
Yeah.
We have tried to make our systems more client focused, and that to me, assigning a number to an intervention doesn't take into account what the client wants at all. So that to me is really important. What Mindy just said about, case managers being key to this, I agree with that. And we have to really balance as case managers, the advocacy for our clients versus, what the system has to offer for all clients, not just our client. That is a very delicate line. And I don't even have the answer how to do it well. I'm sure many of you do it well. It is a very hard thing because we all want to advocate for those that we've met, we know, we've worked with. But maybe they're not the most vulnerable, and that's having real conversations with your clients and with yourself internally of like, am I doing this because it's the best for the client or because I really want the client to have this or be this? So still things we have to balance at every stage.
There's also that balance between, you know, that original graphic that was in the slides is like we went from provider centric to person centric, community centric. So providers have an interest, right? Clients have an interest. The community has an interest. Sometimes those interests don't mesh well together. Sometimes they do. And part of the conversation is saying, like, what may be in the interest, again, yeah, Chris, as a case manager, I'm advocating for my client, but what may be in my client's best interest may not be in the best interest of the community. If we all went with what Mindy's clients are going to get, that may not help our community actually solve the problem of homelessness. And I think taking it out of the case manager thing, but lawyers, right? Like, it's part of the reason why what lawyers do actually doesn't help a lot at the community level, because a lawyer's whole job is to represent that client zealously. And so representing that client zealously may not actually be what the community needs. And the community needs to make some decisions about how to prioritize resources. So as an individual lawyer with an individual client, I want my client to get all the things. That's what I'm going to fight for. Yes, I'm a lawyer who rails against lawyers. That's my whole job in life. I went to law school never to be a lawyer, by the way, so I'm succeeding at my goal. I would love to hear from the rest of you, especially those of you who have been part of the community conversations around CES from the beginning. I would love to hear those perspectives about, like, we had buy-in, we wanted to do the thing isn't working so well now, and like, what do we need to change? And are you able to have those ongoing community conversations about, here's what's not working and what we need to change, what we want to hold on to and what we want to let go of?
And not only that, the ongoing conversations, we are required by HUD to look at our CES system and give it an assessment every year. Is this working? That is HUD saying that we don't expect this to be a static process. So if you're not having those conversations in the community, HUD expects you to have those. This isn't working, or as we had that conversation earlier, we're finding a lot of folks being exited for less than honorable reasons. That's things that the CES rule says you should be looking at on a regular basis. So I'd love to hear folks' reaction to that, as Mindy mentioned.
Melissa, go ahead and unmute yourself. I think I see your hand raised.
Oh, actually, this is Teddy Pierce. I think we got our logins messed up. I'm sorry. No. Somebody warned me about that, and I don't know how many Melissas are going to raise their hand right now, but this conversation really, what it drives home for me, because I've been in this work since 2011, met Chris in 2015 in person, is that, there are two things that have really stood out for me over time, which are, one was when Cindy Crane was down in Dallas, I believe, or Houston. She said that outreach workers would just go out with a phone and they would make a placement on the phone that minute. So, getting it down to the most basic simplicity. And then the other thing that I encountered when I was doing one of the TA jobs in Riverside was a gentleman who was in one of the smaller cities in Riverside County said basically he drove his truck out, that he had a network of people who were living in encampments around this little town. And when a new person came into town, he would drive out there personally. This was a city employee, meet the person, get them what they needed right then. This one man, it was a small environment, right? But you have to look at the simplicity of, like, where have we gone and how much have we confused ourselves, like you brought up here today, to just get to the point. Like, we need to know the programs, we need to know the best fit, and we need the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And if we can get back to those basics, I think that will help quite a bit. Thanks, Mindy, from Teddy.
Yes. Thanks, Teddy. And the mysterious Melissa. I think there were two Melissas on there too. So thanks, Teddy, for letting us know what happened there. I think Riverside's a really great example. And you guys know, like, when I talk to California folks, I always bring up Riverside because Riverside achieved functional zero on veterans homelessness. And you do not do that without a really responsive, robust community level system, right? So there are things that happen there. And I think everybody has those stories about, like, the individual people and the individual programs that do the individual things and get somebody into housing in 24 hours. And that is what we should all be shooting for. But I always take those with a grain of salt, because what happened in Riverside wasn't just that individual guy doing that individual thing. There's also a really robust community level collaboration that's beyond, as we've talked about, beyond just the COC, right? Like there's the mental health system, the county is really heavily involved, right? And all the pieces of the county puzzle that are not just the COC and ESG funding. And I think that's a really important piece of it too. I think the problem that happens, definitely having this conversation about pipeline and really making a fast pipeline and getting folks into housing quickly, but not sliding back into relying on the prowess and best intentions of an individual provider or an individual person. And Teddy, please unmute yourself and throw your ideas out about that too. Like, I'm just always, there's always that tension between like, well, that guy did it great, or this person did it in 24 hours, but how do we build that out? So
I will say, this is my impression as, coming from an HMIS background. I don't think we look at the impact data often enough. I don't think we know how to define impact data. I don't think we look at it often enough. So many COCs are still really getting their federal filings done, getting their state reporting done, but it's not looked at, every couple of weeks, like a plan, like in an impact plan, and I know there are great metrics out there for coordinated entry that either Matt White's group did or somebody's group did, just some really great metrics. But, just look at those metrics and early and often and make those iterations. So if we talk about the feedback looping, I don't see that happening a lot quite anywhere.
Yeah. Agree. Okay, I think we are getting short on time. And you guys, this is such an important conversation. I hope you all will continue it in your own communities. Chris, I'm going to pop it back to you for the last slide, which I am trying to find.
That's A-okay. I think the last
there we go.
Is that exactly perfect. Well, thank you, Mindy, for that great conversation today. And thank you, Nora B, for also helping out.
Yes.
Just want you to know that we are holding another session next week. So that's November the 9th at 11 Pacific Standard Time. That's right. For those of us that observe daylight savings, that happens over this weekend. So we are back to Pacific Standard Time come next week. So we hope to see you there. I just want to thank everyone for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop session offered the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. Look out for more information on this next session, plus our other sessions. We are running a few through the end of the year, not a lot. We are slowing down. Please do, as you exit this session today, a 3-question survey pops up. Please respond to that. We read those every week and we do change. It could change what we do next week at the November 9th meeting. So please do give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you, and we do adjust based on your thoughts. With that, I will thank you for your time and energy today, and we will see you hopefully next week.